Good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to join us for the webinar. My name is Sue-Ann Howardson and I'm a dairy scientist at AHDB Dairy. AHDB is delighted to bring you tonight's webinar, New Thinking on Johne's Disease. Our presenter today is Pete Orpin from the Park Vet Group in Leicestershire and myhealthyherd.com. Tonight's webinar is being delivered in support of the National Johne's Management Plan. AHDB has funded the National Johne's Management Plan with Dairy UK and the milk processor members of the Action Group on Johne's since October 2015. The aim of the National Johne's Management Plan is to control and then reduce the incidence of Johne's disease in dairy cattle with the long-term objective of eliminating the disease if that becomes technically and economically feasible. Processors who have signed up to the plan have asked their farmer suppliers to determine their Johne's risk and status and to put in place one of the 6 control strategies developed by the Action Group on Johne's in consultation with their vets. The Action Johne's initiative has made significant progress in engaging and actively involving dairy farmers and vets in managing and reducing the incidence of Johne's disease in Great Britain. The Action Group estimates that nearly 70% of milk in Great Britain is from dairy farms that are meeting the requirements of the National Johne's Management Plan. Reg Actor are currently consulting on a proposal to make implementation of the National Johne's Management Plan part of the Dairy Farm Standards from October 2019. The Action Johne delivery team aims to ensure consistent messages to dairy farmers and vets. The delivery team manages the Action Johne's website, where you can find out more information on www.actionjohnesuk.org. Tonight's webinar has proved very popular with over 200 registrations from farmers, vets, consultants and others. Pete's presentation will take around 30 to 40 minutes and then there will be time for comments and questions at the end. You will all stay muted throughout the webinar, but if anyone would like to ask a question, then please type your question into the box on the left-hand side of your screens, and I will ask Pete your questions at the end of his presentation. We will aim to finish up within an hour. So without further delay, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for tonight. Pete Orpin works as a farm vet within the Park Vet Group in Leicestershire. He is a founding member of the Johne's Action Group and current chair of the technical group. Pete is the director of myhealthyherd.co.uk and has a long-standing interest in Johne's disease management. He has presented several papers in recent years in the UK, Chile, Japan, Europe and Australia on the practical control of the disease. Pete has worked with Dick Silby through My Healthy Herd to develop a practical Johne's control and protection programme for the UK, which is operational in over 3,000 dairy herds. So without any further delay, it's over to you, Pete.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm pleased to say that you've actually covered off some of my first few slides, so I will go through this fairly quickly. Yeah, thanks for your introduction. I mean, really what I want to do is just a brief resume of the National Johne's Management Plan, where we've got to with that. I'll whip through those quickly. Then I want to talk a bit about the risks of transmission and new thinking on sort of disease progression within infected herds. There's been some quite interesting stuff that's come out in the last 2-3 years on that. And then ultimately provide you some practical top tips on how you can effectively manage and create a clear plan of action for your infected cows. And then finally talk about the concept of the green calving line and the green calf line as a way of producing healthy, productive, low-risk Johne's replacements. So, you know, just the National Johne's Management Plan, it's just all been summarised. Really is a disease reduction plan. There's nothing to fear about joining it. It's been hugely popular within the UK, and indeed, I think it leads the way globally in terms of its engagement. We set out to actually engage all dairy farmers. We wanted to sort of try and protect the uninfected herds as well as manage the infected herds. And our real key priority from the outset was to remove barriers to engagement and motivate vets and farmers to take positive action. What we're trying to do with the National Ionis Management Plan is to break the cycle of infection as it spreads from cow to calf. And if we can do that, we can actually generate more healthy heifers entering the herd, and that will actually sort of, over years, reduce the prevalence nationally. For those of you who have not engaged, if you're one of the 30% that have not got there yet, it's not too scary. You have to speak to your local vet. Hopefully that practice will have somebody who's been trained up in the ONI scheme. They will actually do a risk assessment, a 30 cow screen or a whole herd screen on your herd, and then develop a control plan for you. And there are 6 control strategies, and there's one for every farm in the country, so it is eminently practicable and doable. Why do it? I did a survey of about nearly 400 farmers in 2017, and those that have already engaged have found better overall health of the herd. It's reduced the forced and emergency cull rate, and they've ended up with healthier calves. So, you know, there's no pushback here. I think it's a great opportunity for the industry to get engaged with this disease, because it doesn't do you any favors if you ignore it. For those of you who have already engaged, the next sort of date in mind is October 2019, and at that point we're asking the vets to go out and review the plan that's in place, and check and make sure it's strong enough. So that's what the basis of my presentation is tonight, is talking about really that next stage. How can we tighten the screw on Johne's disease? Okay, so let's talk a little about the new science, and see where that takes us. The Johne's transmission routes, really the most important transmission routes are from an infected cow via its feces to normally young calves. They're the most susceptible. We also know that there's a transmission through milk and colostrum, and we also know that there's a route that goes from an infected cow to its calf, either through in utero or close contact. The one-to-many risks, we'll talk about those, but those are really the feces and the milk. And the one-to-one risks are the ones where an infected cow just infects one calf. So I think it's important to differentiate between the two, because you know they're going to have a different impact in the herd depending on what's happening there. Quite often I get asked, well, there's a lot of stuff we don't know about Johne's, the tests aren't great, blah, 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 and all this sort of thing. Does our accepted knowledge with Johne's disease, does Johne's control work? Well, the Danes actually led the way, and they set about the quarterly milk testing program before we did, and they have tracked it meticulously since its inception. And in Denmark, in the start point, we had 8 to 10% of the animals testing positive in the herds, and they've managed over a 5 or 6 year period to reduce the level of infection to about 2%. They've not managed to get it to 0, but they've got it down to about 2%. They found with this work that also not all herds control the Johne's disease as well as others. Some were better than others, and that's what we're finding in the UK as well. So obviously there's something we can learn from the herds that are doing it right compared to the herds that aren't. So Soren Nielsen is a hugely talented sort of researcher. He did some work on about 1,000 questionnaires from farmers, asking them what they were actually doing. And what they found was that the herds which didn't make really much progress carried on buying cattle in. They allowed the red cows to calve again, and they perhaps controlled the milk risks, but that's pretty much all they did. And they didn't really reduce the prevalence. The herds that had the biggest gains, they basically closed the herd down or reduced the number of cows they were purchasing. They fed waste milk from green cows only, but one of the things they did do was they tried to stop the red cows from calving again. So I think we can learn from that. And so the analysis of the data, they did some clever analysis, and they really found that by stopping purchasing infected animals in, that gave a good gain, almost like a 72% reduction in the incidence. If they didn't allow the red cows to calve again, we actually had almost like a 56% reduction. And if we basically fed from milk from green cows, we had about 40% reduction. So he was able to sort of look at each of those risk factors. So if we were going to sort of summarize this work, and I think this has sort of been repeated worldwide, biosecurity is important. We can't just keep on buying infection in. They've also found that culling was important, avoiding recalving the red cows, that gave strong gains. And they found also that milk risk delivered benefits, but perhaps not as great as the impact of culling or biosecurity was. So the top two are the most important ones to focus on. The question that quite often I get asked is then, well, okay, what's the major risk for my farm? Well, it kind of depends, really. Each farm's going to have its own set of risks, which are farm specific. They're going to depend on your biosecurity, your culling policy and segregation, your strain type, and how long you've been controlling the disease. One size doesn't fit all, so it's no good just getting a standard sort of control plan kind of off the internet and just shoehorning it into your herd. That won't work. You've got to find a plan that's going to work for you. But I think most encouraging is that we know enough. We know enough to control this disease. We know what's important. And I think if I was going to sort of say any sort of top tip, really, the key to successful control and where we've had the biggest gains is where the vet and the farmer and the whole team on the farm have engaged with a plan. It's become a real living sort of plan that everybody buys into. We get great gains with it. Okay, so let's come back to the risks then, because this disease, the way we control this disease is not by testing. Testing is only part of the story. The most important thing we do is to control the risks on the farm. And as I mentioned, these are the main risks that we've got to deal with. These are the major risks. And many of you will have shut these risks off. You will have got to a position where you're segregating your high-risk cows away from your maternity areas. You're probably using artificial milk. You've probably stopped using sort of waste milk for your replacement calves. But not everybody is actually controlling the one-to-one risks as well as we could. So I'm going to talk a little more about that. Just thinking about the one-to-many risks, let's not lose sight of them. If we don't control the one-to-many risks, the plan's not going to work. And this is where you get the epidemic. So if the picture on the right there, if we have a super shedder cow that enters there and that calf is staggering around that yard for a couple of days, then it's going to actually go down with Johne's later on in life. If that yard is mucked out every month, then potentially 30 calves might be exposed to Johne's disease. And that's where you get your epidemic from. With the one-to-one risks, one infected cow infects one calf. And so an example of that would be an in utero sort of infection, where basically through the bloodstream the calf becomes infected. But it's unlikely to create an epidemic. So, you must appreciate there's two different sets of risks here. So just to summarize, the established thinking, three major transmission routes: feces, cow to calf, milk and colostrum, in utero transmission. But how's that thinking changed in recent years? Well, we know that major transmission is still there. We're not going to forget that at any point. But what the Canadians have found is they've found that a red cow can give birth to a red calf, and that calf can be infected, and it can actually spread infection to its mates in the pen. And in their work, they found that one calf could infect about 3 other calves. So we don't know how important this is, but we know this occurs. We know this occurs experimentally. And so I think it would be prudent and sensible for us to incorporate into our Johne's plans a way of managing not only the red cows, but also the red calves. So calf-to-calf transmission is a consideration. And if we can identify high-risk calves and segregate them from the green calves in their environment, it's going to be important for our control plans going forward. So we started off with 3. We're probably adding one or other one there, calf-to-calf transmission. So we've got to add that to the list. So when you're doing your reviews this year with your vet, those of you who've got a plan in place, make sure you have a discussion about how you better manage calf-to-calf risks. Think about the benefits of red tagging high-risk calves and keeping them away from a replacement calf area, that green calf line. And I'm going to talk about that later on. Okay, so that's some of the one-to-many risks. I'm now going to talk about the one-to-one risks and how they work. And this work really comes from the PhD that Karen Bond and her co-workers did in the UK, where they basically looked at 5 herds. And they looked at 5 herds in detail. And what they found was that an infected cow, this is a calf that's infected as a baby, prior to calving, if you were to blood test it, or it would probably test negative. You carry on testing it, and through its first calving, it's testing negative, and indeed by the second calving, it may well still be testing negative. This animal's carrying the infection, but it's controlling it. It's in the controlling phase of the disease. Now, what happens with these infected ones that they lose control of it, and it eventually starts to test positive. Now, this is when the cow is actually losing control of infection. Now, what Karen found interesting with the work is it's not totally surprising that the red cow has got a greater chance of giving birth to a red calf. So that's not exceptional work. They found that it was about 3 times more likely to give birth to a red calf. But what was interesting was that they found the risk of getting an infection in the previous calving, when the cow was green, i.e. testing negative, was also 3 times. So it seems to me that at the time of calving, the cow loses control of infection and perhaps sheds the bacteria a bit more than it does normally, but not enough to actually make it test positive, but enough to affect its calf, its immediate calf. So I think it just takes a bit of getting your head around this, and you'll need to discuss this with your vet in terms of how you're going to control this. So the summary is the last 2 calves from a test positive mother are at equal and increased risk of developing Johne's disease. And in established regularly testing herds where other major risks are controlled, this route can be a very important route. So once you've snuffed out the other risks, this route can be quite an important route. And indeed, what they found in these 5 herds that were on herd-wise testing for 5 years, 60% of the infections in the herd were due to the one-to-one or dam associative risk. So what that means is that if you have been on these testing programs for several years and you are doing all the other stuff right, it is important for you to now to switch some focus onto the one-to-one risks. They're going to be important for you to manage. There were other risks they found in the study. The hygiene in the maternity pen and how long the calf spent in the pen, those were, that made up for the remaining 40% of the risk. But we have to focus on the one-to-one risk as well now. Another bit of work that was done in America, their odds ratio was higher, at 6 times more likely to be seropositive if the dam was infected. And in that particular study, they found that about 1/3 of the infections were attributable to dam rather than the environment. So we have a bit more complex risk patterns to think about. You probably only start getting to this level of complexity once you're comfortable with the major risk controls. You're a year or 2 into your program, you're absolutely sort of sorting things out. And so, you need to add to your list a conversation with your Johne's trained vet. How do you actually sort of manage the calf-to-calf risks on your farm, and how do you manage the dam associative risks? Both those have got to be added to the to-do list. So just to summarize, the dam associative risks are important, especially once the major risks are controlled. These risks can be managed by testing cows to identify high-risk cows and then seeking to selectively breed from low-risk cows. A lot of farms now are using sex semen on their low-risk cows to generate replacements. High-risk calves should be identified and separated from replacement calves and not used for breeding replacements. These are higher risk of going down with a disease later on in life anyway. Try and find a different animal to breed from. That's probably going to give you your best gain. And what some people do in block calving herds, they sometimes go as far as making sure red calves aren't born at the same time as green calves. They delay the serving of the test positive animals for 4 to 6 weeks to make sure you've got a green calving line to deal with, and it's a much simpler system. Okay, so seek to control all the risks of the robust plan, not only those classic major ones, but as you get further down the line, make sure you deal with the one-to-one or dam risks. I think it's important to do that. Otherwise, your infection will trundle on at about a 2% level forever and a day. So there we are. Just summarise it. Your major risk areas are cattle purchase, slurry coming into your farm, infected colostrum. Your one-to-many risks I've talked about. These are the ones where it spreads from cow to calf in maternity and milk and colostrum. And then we've got the one-to-one risks from, heavily infected cows. And then we have some minor risks that we have to talk about, like cow-to-cow transmission. That's much less of a risk, but can occur. And the likes of rabbits and rivers, much lower risks. So it's going to depend. So if you ask me the question, which risk is most important on your farm, it kind of depends where you are on the Johne's journey. And if you are going to control Johne's disease, make sure you start in the right place. So start with your one-to-many risks first. Start with the major one-to-manys. Seek to reduce the prevalence, get engagement with your team, and then tighten the screw with your one-to-ones. So those one-to-one risks, that's when you bring those in once everybody's got their head around everything else. So just to graphically illustrate this, these are, on the left-hand side, we've got a block here which shows a herd with a 10% prevalence. You actually set about a plan where you try and block the major routes of transmission, and you can see the prevalence start to decline, and you probably get to a 2% level 5 years down the track, and there's many farms that are like that. We're going to have less one-to-many cow-to-calf transmissions and fewer heifers infected. That's the reason how it's going to work. But if we don't control calf-to-calf transmission, if we don't control the one-to-one effect, then the infection will still continue. And so you can see that when you get to 5 years, the predominant risks you've got when you're 5 years down the track are very different to the risk when you started. It's really talking about one-to-one dam effect and calf-to-calf transmission. You control the major ones, so the importance of risk will shift. Okay, so take-home message on risks. Make sure you conduct a thorough review of your Johne's risks. That isn't about talking to your vet about Johne's while he's trying to PD 40 cows or something. That's not a proper Johne's risk assessment. There's about 30, 40 questions you've got to go through to do a detailed risk assessment. Walk the farm, make sure you cover all your bases. Use a detailed risk assessment tool. We use My Healthy Herd, others in the National Johne's Management Plan. You're not restricted. You can use whatever risk assessment tool you wish. But be mindful that if you end up with 80% control, you can end up with 100% failure, and you won't know about it until 5 years' time. So if you're going to do it properly, do it well, and you'll get to where you want to get to. Okay, so that's about risks. Let's think a little about immunity and resilience. Do all cows behave the same? Well, they're not. Not all cows are the same. So if we have our infected animal, it has choices, and some animals seems to be progressors. They develop the disease, they test positive, they become infectious, they have a short latent period. These are the ones that end up sort of crashing and burning with the disease. But there are also a sector of cows which are non-progressors. They're more resilient and tolerant. They may only intermittently shed, and they may have a longer latent period. And it seems to me that immunity and resilience comes to play here, and stress also comes to play. So we're not quite certain how it all works in life, but we all know that if we stress these infected cows, we've got more likely for them to break down with the disease. So if they move to a different farm, they're more likely to break down. If they develop lameness or mastitis, they're more likely to break down. So it's likely that genetics, the strain of Johne's, the dose they get is all going to influence which route they go down. So very high dose with a susceptible genetic animal with a virulent strain of Johne's, you're going to end up with more progressors, and then the opposite equally applies. So you need a herder-specific plan. Your farm is different to your neighbours. And just to show you how this works, this is some data from a low-yielding once-a-day herd spring block calving. And it was quite interesting. The farmer said to me, I don't understand what's going on here. I'm having animals test positive in the summer when they're milking hard, but when they come to dry off, they test negative. And this is interesting data. If you look at this, there's a lot of cows there that have tested strongly positive at certain times of the year, but when the pressure's off, they actually stop progressing and gain control back of the disease. So this just clearly illustrates that you have to look at a series of test results. You've also got to actually interpret them carefully. Okay, let's just talk about some common mistakes you can make with Johne's control, and this is what we're finding. One of the common mistakes we have is failing to control the major risks. So we might have somebody that will pasteurize the milk, but not segregate the cows. That will not work. You've got to control all the risks. We also have a situation where people pay for the testing, but then do nothing with the results. That's not going to work either. And sometimes you have a situation where the challenge of hygiene is not strong enough to actually sort of control the disease. So we've got to control the important risks, not the easy ones. When you get to a high level control, when you've got your major risks under control, try and breed from offspring from test negative dams. And indeed, there are reports that can help you with this. You can run a report through Interherd. CIS has a method of doing it as well, where you can identify the status of the dam and then identify whether this whether the actual calf is high or low risks. And I think if you can identify those low risk cows for sourcing replacements from, and most herds will easily find half the herd that are low risk, then they're the ones that you should go to get your replacement calves from. Test results can be a bit challenging, and that's why you need your vet to help you with them. Just testing is not going to be enough. You've got to discuss those results. And what I think is important to do is to have a clear plan of action. When you get those results on a quarterly basis, have a clear plan of action, assign it, cull, do not serve, breed to beef, or retest. And there's no point spending 8 or 10 quid on cows for testing, but if you don't do the right thing with the result. And it's particularly relevant where you have, say, TB breakdowns, and it can be slightly more challenging to interpret the results. You do need professional support by analysing the results carefully. So think about those 4 possible actions: breed to terminal sire, cull, do not serve, or retest. And that will depend on the test result, how the animal's performing, your own views on the animal. There's a discussion to be had with those animals, and I think it's important that we make the right decision. If we can make sure that we don't get these test positive animals pregnant, then you're in a good position to remove them at the right stage. Increasingly, what people are doing now as well is once an animal tests positive, they put a red tag in its ear. So any animal testing positive is tagged, and any calf which is born from a test positive dam or you think has been exposed to infection, you basically put a tag in it and define it as a high risk calf as well. You then make sure that these red tag animals don't enter the green areas of the farm. And they require thinking. So when somebody sees a red tag, they know it shouldn't go into the green areas, but they also have to think about what should happen to it in terms of its culling and its breeding. So how are we going to optimize those culling decisions? Think about what's been done before. In all the science, there's been a lot of evidence base here. Failing to cull red cows at the end of lactation is a real common reason why plans fail to deliver. If we hang on to the strongly positive cows, we're going to get a high infectious dose within the herd, and we're going to have more super shedders in the herd. So by removing those cows, you're going to remove that risk. We're not in the game of killing everything. We're in the process of looking at results and trying to identify the ones where we're going to get the best possible gain. And we don't want clinical cows there. We don't want high test positive cows hanging around the farm forever and a day, because this is going to cause challenges for the farm. We want to manage the other ones so that we can economically remove them at the right stage. So we think about the benefits of planned culling. It's going to maximize carcass value for sure. It's going to reduce welfare risk for that cow because it gets removed before the disease takes place. It's going to give you a much better cost benefit. And most importantly, it's going to reduce the risk of accidental cross-contamination through tractor scrapers, Wellington boots, overalls, all that sort of thing. For the herd, you're going to reduce that infection load within the herd. There's less need for segregation, and the size of the leper colony reduces because we've managed to barren the cows out rather than simply getting them in calf and then having to try and deal with a heavily pregnant cow. And it makes it simpler for your calf management because you have less red calves being born. So I think planned, targeted culling led by veterinary surgeons will give you the best results. The other common mistake is failing to segregate. Famous slide here. We're trying to actually protect the calves. So we make sure the amber calves don't go into the green calving area. We make sure we actually try and cull out the most severely testing, the highest test positive animals. We let the green cows go into the green calving line. But what we're really trying to do is to make sure we protect that green calf area from the actual feces of the cow. We're also going to make sure we don't bring in any random cows. We don't bring in green cows or low risk cows. That's what we want to do, or ideally not purchase at all. And if we do that, we get good results. Now, just quickly, I'm just going to show you why it's important to actually cull these red cows out. These are graphs. The red line shows you when they get above that, that's when they test positive. When they're below it, they're testing negative. And the numbers relate to the herd-wise results. And this is some trial work I was doing, and latterly they were being tested every month. And you can see the numbers there. The cow on the left, it was 138, 134, a very high testing positive animal. We did PCR tests on it, and it was absolutely glow in the dark for yonis. It was throwing out a heck of a lot of yonis. The cow on the right was much the same. That went positive before calving, then obviously wasn't tested at calving, and then was immediately positive thereafter. And they, not surprisingly, were heavy shedders. If these animals were not segregated, the control wouldn't work. What we did do, though, we looked at some other cows which were just these intermediate sort of cows. So there's one cow here that in June of that year, it basically just got above the positive line. And then when we tested it around calving, we found it was an intermittent or low-grade shedder. Another cow, 602, again, just above the positive line. And then when we tested that after calving, that was a low-grade shedder. So you can see that you've got to actually take these results seriously. The other one is hygiene. Make sure the hygiene's right. Why do I say that? This is an interesting cow. This is 27 on the left. This cow, we tested it by PCR around calving. It had a previous result of 26 back in January, but at the time of calving, we found it was shedding. That cow subsequently went on to become strongly positive. Similarly, cow 91, tested positive once, some months before. It had a couple of negative PCRs and then light shedding in October. So you can see, you can get the story. You know, it's important that we use hygiene as well, because not all green cows are going to be not shedding at all. There may be light shedders, and we've got to make sure we cover that off. So quite often calving stress triggers the shedding. So just to summarise, make sure you red tag those high risk animals. Any animal testing positive in its life should be red tagged. Any calf born from a test positive dam should be tagged. And if we do that, we create hopefully a low risk Johne's environment where you've got hygienic sort of maternity areas and hygienic calf areas that minimise the risk of feces entering the actual mouth of the calf. If we have less hygienic areas, there's much higher risk of transmission within those environments. And so if those were green cows and it's a heavy challenge, you still could get transmission occurring here. So we've got to do a belts and braces. So if we get something slipping through the net, that's where you can get the breakdowns occurring. You can get one-to-many transmission, cow-to-calf transmission, and calf-to-calf transmission. So we've got to try and get the hygiene right. So just let's think about your Johne's review. Use that review not just to do a tick box exercise. Educate and motivate your team. Did one today, excellent session. Went through a short PowerPoint about the disease, got the team around. We then had a real discussion and everybody agreed what they were going to do, and that was incorporated into the plan. So in essence, the plan is the summary of the farm walk, the meetings, the discussions we actually have on the farm. Repeat your risk assessments because things do change. Make sure you're still on the right strategy for that farm, and try and revisit the plan on an ongoing basis. This shouldn't be just once a year that you do this. You have actually just got to keep the momentum going. Make sure you control the important risks, not just the easy ones. We're trying to break the Johne's cycle. So that's what we're trying to do, to try and protect the calf from becoming infected. To do that, we want to cull your repeat high test positive animals. Once you have a couple of counts over 60, those cows should be nudged out sooner rather than later. Try and create a green calving line with improved farm management and effective segregation. And we should try and protect young stock from exposure from MAP in the first 2 years of life. We don't want slurry going onto their pastures, and we don't want that exposure occurring. Try and make your plan as strong as you can. Tag all test positive cows and segregate them. Assign an action for every cow. Delay breeding of red tag cows in block calving herds. Manage high risk calves by tagging and rearing of beef and culling. Create disease-free replacements reared in a low-risk MAP environment. That's what we're trying to do. And you can achieve that using selective breeding, sex semen, to make sure you breed from the lowest risk cows in the herd. Think about the environments. Try and find times of year where it's easier for you to source your replacements. You might find certain times of the year you've got less stocking pressure, and you may be able to create a better environment to source your replacements at that time of year. You're aiming to try and create your own green calving and calf line. If you achieve that, not only will you control Johne's disease, but you'll also go a long way towards controlling crypto, rota, and lots of other diseases too. So, bit of a whistle-stop tour. Hopefully you've got something from that, and I look forward to receiving your questions.
Thanks a million, Pete. Very interesting presentation. And while I'm waiting for some questions to come up, you can type these into the box at the bottom of your screen. I'd also like just to remind you that tonight's presentation has been recorded and will be available to watch back on the AHDB website along with previous webinars. So the questions are coming in, so we'll kick off with a question from Chris. There has been strong talk of blood tests which can find the DNA of the disease at a very young age, i.e. under a year old. Obviously, this would be a game changer. Is there any news on a licensing date?
I'm not aware of it. I mean, it's obviously novel science for sure. This is the sort of phage test. And the challenge we have is that the test may be so sensitive, it will identify any calf that may have the bug within it, but does that necessarily predict when that animal is going to go down with the disease? And how helpful would it be if we actually were to find out that there was a large number of calves infected at that stage, because not all of them would necessarily go down with the disease because of either the dose or the genetics or whatever. So really, in order to get our head around that test, we'd need to have a longitudinal study to identify, is it a predictor of future infection or not? So yeah, it's a new test, and you know, there's lots more we can do with testing, but I don't think the science is quite there yet for us to use that in an informed way yet, anyway, in terms of any published data.
Great, thank you, Pete. And the next question is from Andrew. You mentioned an uptake of some level of control amongst approximately 70% of dairy farms. How realistic is the ultimate goal of eradication, given the fact that the beef industry is significantly lower than this, and ultimately many beef producers have no tangible incentive to undertake control measures?
I agree. It's an interesting point. So if we take the dairy sector as it alone, I mean, it's certainly not going to be in my lifetime that we seek to eradicate Johne's disease. And many workers would say it's probably technically impossible because it can survive in soil and amoeba for 2 or 3 years. It's in waterways and whatever. My own personal belief is that what we're seeking to do with the dairy herd is to reduce the prevalence to a very low level, such that the milk and meat that is produced from those herds is wholesome and those animals have high welfare and it is not a problem. The beef sector is a very interesting one. What do we do with the beef sector? We have discussed that at the action group. It's more challenging. There's many more herds than we have in the dairy herd, breeding herds to control, many more producers. So that is a separate discussion for another day, but it's certainly a big challenge, and I fully accept that. So in summary, yes, I would agree. Eradicating Johne's from the UK, I don't see that happening, to be honest. Eradicating it from the national dairy herd, I probably don't see that happening either. But what we're looking to try and do is to get it to be a position of a minor nuisance.
Great, thank you. And the next question is from James. Are there any ages when red tagged young stock can safely mix with green young stock?
That's a good point. I mean, what's going to happen with the work has been shown that the shedding can carry on for at least the first 12 months of life, but there's going to be more resistance as they get older. So there is some element of age resistance there as well. So it is a complicated question, but we were talking today about it, and the longer you can separate them, the better it's going to be. But certainly the first 3 months would be a very good target to do. And after that, then obviously, the more you can continue that segregation, the better the result will be. I think what many people will do, I think, is when they get into the process of selective breeding, they will try and find a way of not having red calves being born in the first place. And I think that's probably the easiest way of doing it. We might just have the odd one slipping through in animals that test positive after it's got in calf. But we shouldn't be breeding from animals which have got a long history of testing positive. So I think we can probably get around some of it by that.
Great, thank you. Next question from Julie. Are there any countries in Europe clear of Johne's?
Well, Scandinavia claim that they are. I'm not so certain how robust the testing is. So, you know, I think many workers would take the view that most countries have it, but the level they end up with depends on the risk factors within their industry. So if you have very small herds, the transmission and the spread of the disease is nowhere near as great as it is when we get to larger herds. So most of the major dairy producing areas of the world have this disease to tackle, and what is interesting is that not all of them have been successful in developing effective Johne's control programs like we have. So we're pleased with the progress we've made.
Great, thank you. Next question from Caroline. How long should you leave fields after spreading slurry before stocking?
Yeah, again, that's going to depend on how infectious your slurry is. So I think that's one of the complications you have. So if you in the bad habit of retaining very, very heavy shedding cows or super shedding cows within your herd, i.e. you don't have an effective culling program, your slurry is going to be more infectious. So, we know it survives for 11 months in slurry, whereas in the past we used to use sort of deep litter and that composted and heated up. So there is a risk there. Now, if this slurry goes on to adult pasture, then there is more of an age resistance there. But certainly, I wouldn't be looking to put any slurry from the adult herd onto young stock pasture that is grazed that same season.
Great, thank you. Next question from Andrew. Please could you discuss any measures to offset the fact that a J0 can be served and confirmed in calf before she becomes a J4 and subsequently a J5? Similarly, colostrum records enable tracking back to find where colostrum later confirmed as red was fed when it was green.
Well, you'll probably have to repeat the second question because the first one's quite a complicated one anyway. Yeah, there is some work that we've tried to encourage AHDB to do, and I think it's ongoing, is can we actually look at prior test results and predict which cows are going to go positive? And I think that would be really helpful. Certainly, I take a lot more interest now at looking at results between 20 and 30, for instance, and if I see an animal bumping up with these low or inconclusive results, as that trial work showed, is that quite often that may be a predictor. The science isn't there yet. I don't think we've got the published work yet, but that's something which we're planning to do. But it is frustrating, I know that. The only other thing we can do is to make sure that we don't breed from higher risk animals. So if it was a red calf, i.e. it came from a red mother, then not breeding breeding it to a replacement breed would be helpful, and that's what we're tending to do on our own herds. So by using those sort of reports, you can actually sort of make sure you do your very best to minimise that occurring. What was the second question again?
Oh, sorry, I've lost it. Andrew, if you can retype that one, that would be great. What are your feelings on Johne's vaccine?
Johne's vaccination is an interesting one. We know it works well in sheep. It has reasonable effect in adult cows, in cattle rather. So it has to be given at a very young age, relatively young age. However, the problems probably overwhelm the actual advantages. So one of the difficulties we have is that it interferes with the TB test. So you've got more risk of false positives occurring when you TB test, particularly if you get into a severe interpretation. You also have difficulty then moving away from vaccination to any other strategy apart from improved farm management because it interferes with testing. So yeah, it can be done. We know there's certain parts of the world where they've done it and they've done it reasonably successfully, but those countries aren't blessed with TB. So that's part of the reason why, as a group, we've left it there as a possibility, but that needs to be very carefully discussed with the vet to make sure the right decision is made, and it's thought right through as to how it's going to work now, but how it's going to work in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. Really should only be used for a short period of time to tidy up the herd and then move onwards from there.
Great, thank you. Hannah says, thank you for this. Regarding the phage test, any comment on phage negative, ELISA positive animals?
I don't have any comment on that because I've not worked with the phage testing system. I saw some data from it in terms of it was published in Brussels, and obviously there's intermittent sort of correlation between PCR, phage, and ELISA. These are all different tests, all with different levels of sensitivities and cutoffs. So it's going to be different for sure. So what we do know from the actual ELISA test is that animals will start to intermittently shed, and that's what triggers the ELISA response. So that intermittent shedding will occur probably 4 to 6 weeks ahead of the actual ELISA response. So by the time they get to persistent shedding, that's when they end up in these J5 categories and this sort of thing and become heavy shedders. So I know a lot more about the ELISA test and PCR test, but I'm afraid I'm not an expert in the phage test. That's too early days yet.
Great, thank you, Pete. The next question is from Becky. Is there any evidence that cows can pass the disease to another cow? It has been mentioned to them that a reading over 100 can mean that the cow can spread that disease within your herd. Is this correct?
Okay. So the reading of 100, where that came from, this is work that was done by Martin Webber in Holland, where they actually got large numbers of cows, and their cutoff is, I think, 100, just over 100 for their culling program. And they then did confirmatory PCR tests. And what they found was that once they get above that sort of level, 85% of them were classed as heavy shedders. So those animals are heavy shedding cows once they get up to that level. The 2 counts above 60 was the recommendation that Sorrell Nielsen gave as an intervention point for, saying that animals should be prioritised for culling. And that was, again, based on PCR tests sort of thing. As terms of cow-to-cow transmission will depend on the infectious dose. And if you have a system on your farm where cow feces can contaminate the actual water troughs and contaminate the food of the cows, work has been done where they've got truly test negative adult cows and put them into infected herds, and you will get adult cow transmission. The benefit, however, is that if you infect an animal who's 5 years of age and the incubation period is another 3 years, there's not that many 8-10-year-old cows in the herd. So I wouldn't get hung up about adult to adult transmission, but it can be important in certain circumstances if you have got fecal loading of the adult sort of feed and water, and particularly if you've got super shedders, and particularly if you've got a heavy challenge going into them on a daily basis.
Great, thank you, Pete. The next question is from Neil. Is there a significant risk of calf-to-calf spread? Would it not be sensible to rear calves in individual pens, not in pairs, in herds with a moderate to high prevalence?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point, isn't it? It's an interesting point, and yeah, I mean, I think obviously there are arguments about the individual versus pair rearing of calves, and I'm acutely sensitive of that in terms of that aspect. But I think what you can do is to actually make sure that you actually try and segregate your red calf. And quite often people will have beef calves which are destined for slaughter anyway, and they're mixed with those, and that's a way of actually managing the risk. And that's sometimes more practical because not everybody obviously has individual housing. But yeah, I accept your point that obviously, if they are segregated, then you are going to be having that benefit.
Great, thank you. There's a few questions coming around milk replacer powders. I'm just going to bundle them together. So, can we be confident that milk replacement powder is Johne's free?
Yeah, that's an interesting one again. And again, I think it's a dose-dependent thing. I think the question we would have to think about is that, do we have evidence of herds going down with Johne's disease that are truly closed herds when they fed artificial milk? And I'm not aware that there's been any publication of that showing that milk is a significant risk factor. And interestingly, what was interesting with Sorrell Nielsen's work, even feeding waste milk, wasn't anywhere near as great a risk as the actual fecal risks. So I think we probably exaggerated the milk risk. So I would if I put risks in order, and you can never say anything zero risk, but you're starting off with those real one-to-many risks we talked about earlier on in the presentation. We're then starting to talk about how we actually sort of protect the green calving line and the calf-to-calf transmission. We then start talking on the one-to-one transmission risks. You know, when we start worrying about milk powder, we're way down at the bottom. I wouldn't worry about that until we've got all the other things sorted out. The dose that you're going to have, you know, obviously the milk will not be sourced from test negative herds. It does go through processing, and that's going to go to some degree, to actually a large degree, to actually reduce the level of infection within that product.
Great, thank you. A few questions to go through, so hopefully we'll be able to answer these. A question from Matthew: could a lepto vaccination be a stressor for cows going from a reading of single figures to then becoming J2, J3, J4?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, the stresses. We've seen it. There's lots of things that can cause stress on cows. I mentioned it where we've seen movement of animals from a herd which ostensibly has a very relatively low prevalence, and then the herd is dispersed, and we suddenly find that moving to another farm will cause that stress. We see it with acidosis for sure. We know there's an association between lameness and mastitis. That's one. Vaccination, well, we have a lot of herds that are vaccinated. I've not heard of that before. As a finding. But you know, obviously, you know, maybe depends on the amount of stress that's going on around that vaccination. It may be that lepto vaccinations occurring around turnout, for instance. Is that the stress? But I'm not aware of anything that sort of has linked vaccination with breakdown of Johne's disease. And certainly there's millions of doses sold anyway.
Great, thank you. A short question from Kim: what percentage of dairy herds are Johne's free? I'm not sure if he's talking GB or globally. There's not more details. Yeah,
well, I don't like the term Johne's free. I think probably best to sort of say low prevalence or test negative or whatever. There is a significant proportion of herds that have been testing, for instance, within the Tesco scheme, that are repeatedly testing negative. So it would be an estimate. But you know, it's going to vary, possibly 30 to 50% low prevalence. But we don't know because we haven't got a structured surveillance of all herds. The work's been done in different countries, and you know, in the smaller herds in Canada, they had a pretty low prevalence there. They had a prevalence of about 0.5% in those 40 cow herds over there, whereas obviously the prevalence is much higher in larger herds. So, you know, I think in the UK, as herd sizes increase, it makes it more challenging for us, you know, because the disease is more difficult to control in large herds. We're finding that with TB as well. So I'm not sure I can answer the question fully, but there is a significant proportion of low prevalence herds already, and there's a greater number which are actually becoming lower prevalence as we speak. So we're on the way.
Great, thank you. So the last questions, and then we will be out of time. So the last question is from Chris: in herds with large numbers of red cows, how do you suggest they go about getting the incidence down when young stock numbers may not be large enough to cover all of the culling required?
Yeah, that's tough. What you have to do really is, you know, you've got to be quite targeting about the culling, and you have to adjust your culling criteria to fit the farm. So I would strongly advise you not to sort of adopt a policy where you just kill all the test positive animals tomorrow, because, you know, that will financially put huge financial strain on the farm, because you just won't sell enough milk. So you have to selectively cull. You'd need to have veterinary advice as to which ones you'd do. You'd probably do more in the way of segregation. You would then put about a plan where you would either try and source replacements from a known green low risk herd, or you would actually switch fairly quickly to using sex semen. And that's what we've seen as being almost like a quiet revolution for Johne's control. It's allowed us to actually get out of that problem. We had that problem 10 years ago. It's much less of a problem now because people have latched on to using sex semen in the actual low risk dams. to source replacements from.
Great, thank you very much. A big thank you for you all for listening. We've had a great turnout and participation in this webinar. Please keep an eye out on the AHDB Dairy YouTube channel for future webinars. The next webinar will take place on July the 4th, focusing on grazing strategies. A very special thank you to Pete for taking time out of his busy day. The recording of this webinar will be available to watch back on the AHDB website in due course. All of those that have registered will receive an email alerting you when it's live on the website. Thank you all and good night.